Hey, folks, it's your buddy Mike Messier, One Pro Wrestling and Sports Fan YouTube channel. I'm very honored and happy to have my friend Evan Ginsburg, the associate producer on The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke, Oscar nominated, should have won the Oscar for that, and also 365 days featuring a who's who of professional wrestling, talking about basically the 1960s through 1990s pro wrestling. 350 days, right?
350 days. You were
Yeah,
close. Yeah.
yeah, because for those guys, it felt like 365 days, but 350 days is the approximate amount of days these guys wrestled back then, a year. When you're talking about the Ox Bakers, the Johnny Valentines, the Wahoo McDaniels, and so if you haven't seen his documentary, Evan Ginsburg's 350 Days is an awesome go-to resource, and the young wrestlers should watch this documentary, Evan, to appreciate what these guys went through to pave the way for them today. Don't you think?
Absolutely. The title comes from the fact that guys like Ric Flair, the NWA champions, wrestled 350 days a year, which is an insane lifestyle. And wrestlers do not like the word fake because they'll say my divorces weren't fake, my missing my kids, graduation, birth, whatever the case may be, wasn't fake, and my knee replacement, my hip replacement, etc., so on, was not fake. So Greg Valentine, who's in the film, told us he at his peak he was wrestling 320 days. Bret Hart, who's one of the stars of the film, says he wrestled 330 days as champion. It's a brutal lifestyle, and people don't realize. And when a lot of these guys who walk away with no pensions, no health insurance, a lot of these guys do not end up well, and it's a shame. And they're a billion-dollar corporation now, WWE. They should, like the NFL, take care of their legends and pioneers. And you can hear the police in the background. This is the gritty streets of New York, as you could tell by my accent.
Well, it's all good, man. And speaking of Greg Valentine, his first SummerSlam appearance was at SummerSlam 1989. Unfortunately, he was at the short end of the stick, losing in 3 minutes and 8 seconds to the mighty Hercules. And you also mentioned Bret Hart. Bret Hart, I'm telling you, Evan, the early SummerSlams for me, let's get into the SummerSlam talk. It's the story of two wrestlers. One was peaking in the early SummerSlams, and one, you can see this beautiful character arc. Let me first talk about the Ultimate Warrior. He is no longer with us. He was controversial after being a wrestler. He was more controversial after being a pro wrestler than he was as a wrestler. Evan, when I say Ultimate Warrior, and specifically in coalition with SummerSlam, what are some of your opening thoughts on that subject?
Well, Rick Rude and Ultimate Warrior 1989 was a very good match, and I'm not the biggest Ultimate Warrior fan. And I believe the match with Zeus was a SummerSlam as well, with Hogan and Zeus against Savage, and I'm trying to refresh my memory.
Yeah, it was Hogan and Beefcake against Savage and Zeus at the main event of SummerSlam '89.
Yeah, I was actually at that match, and it was colorful. I would not say it was any kind of great match, and Zeus did a good impression of a pro wrestler. He was really an actor. I met him. He was an imposing-looking guy, but when you spoke to him, he was a nice enough guy. So, but yeah, that was a very colorful match. And to me, you mentioned Bret Hart. The greatest SummerSlam match was Bret Hart and British Bulldog. That was wrestling elevated to art.
Well, Evan, that's a match that's a keystone of my take on this, because in my opinion, Hulk Hogan was Mr. WrestleMania in the first 9 WrestleManias. You got to say that Hogan was the main event at WrestleMania, one way or another, through hook or through crook. Hogan was the main event, you know what I mean? But SummerSlam, it's really like Ultimate Warrior. I'll just give you the brief overview. He wins the Intercontinental title over the Honky Tonk Man in 31 seconds. He was a surprise opponent. Beefcake was injured because of the attack by Ron Bass. That was an MSG. A year later, the show you were at the Meadowlands, which to me, the Meadowlands always is like an arena that I'd love to go to, you know. But the Ultimate Warrior pins Rick Rude in 16 minutes and 2 seconds to regain the Intercontinental title. The next year, it's 1990. The Warrior has defeated Hogan at WrestleMania, and they're in Philadelphia, the Spectrum, one of the classic WWF arenas, and where Bruno and Backlund and all Pedro and Stasiak, all those guys were at the Spectrum, and the Ultimate Warrior. Um, Basically, he defends the title in a cage against ravishing Rick Rude. And then 1991, oddly enough, the Ultimate Warrior and Hogan team up in a tag team match against a really interesting team, Sergeant Slaughter, Colonel Mustafa, who, of course, we know is the Iron Sheik, General Adnan, who's we used to know him as Sheik Adnan LKC in the actually, yeah, that's who he was in the AWA. And so Warrior was actually, to me, Evan, like the main event guy at these SummerSlams. But the real story is the arc that I'd like to get into with you about Bret Hart. SummerSlam 88, him and Jim Neidhart lose a tag team title match to the defending champions of Demolition. 1989, they lose. Him, Bret Hart, and Jim the Anvil Neidhart lose in the opener of all things in a non-title match against the newly crowned champions, the Brainbusters, Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson, which is kind of surprising, as you know, Evan, and speak on this for a moment, how the WWF, Vince McMahon, loved to bury NWA guys, but for some reason, Tully and Arn came in, they won the belts within 4 or 5 months, and then they beat the Hart Foundation, one of the WWF's top tag teams, in a non-title match at SummerSlam. What did you think about that one?
They got a big push. They put them with Heenan to begin with, and it was almost the exception to the rule. They were so extraordinary. I mean, the Horsemen were probably the greatest faction of all time, and Tully Blanchard, whether it was solo or with Arn, is top 20 heel of all time, easy, and Arn was tremendous, and God, I saw them lose the belts in the NWA live to the Midnight Express. That was a great match. And, I love those guys. And on occasion, Vince, would push the NWA guys, but more so, he buried tons of them. Barry Windham, who was NWA champ, got one stupid gimmick after another. The new Blackjacks, the Widowmaker, etc., so on. Barry Windham was just squandered in WWF, and there were guys who headlined at NWA who did nothing in WWE, and Dory Funk, the world champion, becomes Horse Funk, and then when Terry walks away in disgust, they invent a Funk.
Jimmy Jack Funk.
Jesse Barr becomes JJ Funk, and like I said, a lot of the NWA guys, Ron Bass was a lesser star in WWE. Al Perez was basically in prelims, and he was a top-notch guy. I mean, UWF, NWA. So, yeah, if you weren't like homegrown, Vince, for the most part, didn't do well with the NWA guys, and it's a shame because they had the talent, but wrestling wasn't the foremost thing that was pushed. It was the gimmicks. It was about selling those T-shirts and the merch, and the silly gimmicks meant more. Skinner, for example,
right? Steve Kern.
Yeah, Steve Kern was a tremendous wrestler and a main event guy in NWA, and he would get title shots with Flair, and all of a sudden he's Skinner, the alligator guy. I mean,
and the best thing that Skinner ever did in WWF as far as matches was the Tuesday in Texas losing an Intercontinental title challenge match to Bret Hart. I think that was the first match on Tuesday in Texas, and it was actually a really good match for both guys, although, obviously Skinner lost. But going back to Bret Hart, SummerSlam 1990 at the Spectrum, the really interesting match, and let's talk about this one. The Hart Foundation defeat Demolition, Smash, and Crush. Some interesting things going on here. Demolition Axe, who Bill Eadie, the Mass Superstar, was injured. They brought in a young Brian Adams, who they actually liked. Smash and Crush, Barry Darsow and Bill Eadie said that they respected Brian Adams because he respected them, and they all got along for the situation. He was basically there in the Freebird type of rule because they had an injured Bill Eadie.
Right.
But they were, we all thought they were headed to this feud with the Legion of Doom, the Road Warriors, who had just come in from the NWA. Unfortunately, or not, Vince, I think, my opinion, Evan, is that Vince didn't really want to put Demolition over the LOD because he saw that Eadie had these injuries and maybe the Demolition was just wearing their welcome out. So he didn't want to put Demolition over the LOD. He didn't want to put the LOD over Demolition because the LOD were the NWA guys, and he doesn't want to. So basically, it's like, how do we have this match without actually having it? And the answer is, well, we'll put the Hart Foundation in there. They're WWF homegrown talent. We'll have them beat Demolition, but we'll get the assist to the Hart Foundation with help from the LOD. So it kind of, in a way, negotiates this blockbuster feud that could have been between Demolition and the LOD. It basically avoids the booking that we all wanted to see. What did you think of all that, Evan?
Well, they did headline house shows, not major pay-per-views, Demolition against LOD. And on some nights, it was all three Demolition against LOD and Ellering. People forget that Ellering was a wrestler. Ellering, in his heyday, was built like LOD. He was a huge muscle guy. People tend to forget all this. So they did have their feud, but much of the time it was indecisive, and it never really proved anything. And LOD themselves kind of obliterated, and Hawk went to Japan and split up the team, and it kind of all fell apart anyway.
Yeah, and then they did have this match at Survivor Series, which is really interesting. The Survivor Series match that year would be the three members of Demolition teaming up with Kurt Hennig. I always want to say Henning with an N at the end, but it's Hennig. And they fought Kerry Von Erich, the Texas Tornado, or the modern day Warrior, as the NWA fans knew him as, and the Ultimate Warrior, and Hawk and Animal. And so it was Team Warrior defeating Team Demolition and Mr. Perfect. But the funny thing with that, Evan, is it wasn't even Bill Eadie as Axe. They actually substituted Steve Lombardi as Axe that night because Eadie was so injured he couldn't even wrestle. So moving forth to 1990, the Hart Foundation get the tag team belts. A year later, Brett defeats Mr. Perfect. This was at SummerSlam 91 back in Madison Square Garden. 20,000 people seeing this. SummerSlam 91, I thought, was a really good show. That's when you had Mr. Perfect and Bret Hart. You had an opening six-man tag, Davey Boy Smith, the British Bulldog, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, and Kerry Von Erich defeat a team that I thought was great. Power and Glory, Paul Roma and Hercules, and the Warlord. Any thoughts on those six guys? What an opener that is, Evan.
I think one of the weaknesses that WWE and today's AEW have is just slapping together six guys where there's no real connection between any of them. I think it's just a matter of finding a spot for a lot of guys and using their names as opposed to it making any booking sense. I go to AEW pay-per-views today, and you'll sit through 15 matches, and a chunk of them are 6, 8, 10 guys that are just kind of slapped together. And to me, it's always like, I look at it as lazy booking. I mean, every once in a while, back in the day, you'd get a six-man tag. For example, Ernie Ladd, Ivan Koloff, and Superstar Billy Graham teaming together, or Andre the Giant and Dusty Rhodes and Mil Mascaras teaming together, and you kind of sit there in awe and wonder, the incredible, charisma off the charts of teams like that. But to throw together Power and Glory and a third, unconnected guy, it never really meant much to me, honestly.
there was a connection of sorts that all three, Power and Glory and the Warlord, were all managed by the Slickster.
Okay.
So
Okay.
so they were the team Slick, I guess you'd call it. But and Steamboat, British Bulldog, and Carey were basically like they all turned out to be Intercontinental champions at one point or another. At this point, Davy Boy had yet to win the title. Steamboat had held it back 4 years earlier at 87. Carey had won it a year earlier at SummerSlam 90. So you kind of had like the upper middle card babyface contingency against Team Slick. But this SummerSlam, Evan, to me, is when we start seeing, if we hadn't seen it before, this is when Bret Hart starts taking over the company as far as wrestling goes, because Bret Hart finally gets his, according to him, they were promising him for 5 years, going back to 88. And even before then, we're going to give you a big singles push. We're going to give you a big singles push. Hold on tight. And they kind of teased it going back to 88 at WrestleMania when he was the last guy. He actually won the Battle Royal, didn't he? And then Bad News Brown beat up Bret Hart to win the Battle Royal after they agreed to split it. And so they were telling Bret at that time, we're going to make you a big solo star, but instead they just fed him to Bad News Brown across the country. So Bret, around SummerSlam 91, Mr. Perfect's got a bad back, but credit to Mr. Perfect, Kurt Hennig. He comes into the ring, bad back and all, and you could never tell unless you heard the story from Bret or somebody else what Mr. Perfect was going through with that pain, the agony, but he wanted to do the right thing. Old school Larry Hennig ethics. And he goes 18 minutes and 4 seconds, puts over Bret via submission to the sharpshooter. New York City, Madison Square Garden. I mean, Evan, talk to me. What does that mean for a wrestler to win their first singles title, especially with the Intercontinental title, with the history of Magnificent Morocco and Ken Patera and Pat Patterson and Pedro Morales? What does that mean, Randy Savage? What does that mean in 1991 for Bret Hart?
Well, before Madison Square Garden became just another pit stop for WWE, in 1991, it still had the prestige as the mecca of pro wrestling, the #1 wrestling arena in the world, the rich history of Madison Square Garden, going back to Bruno, and even before that in the 50s, Antonino Rocca and Buddy Rogers and such. So the rich history, and somebody like Bret Hart, who was weaned in the wrestling business, he would appreciate that. And to this day, a lot of wrestlers, the first time they wrestle at the Garden, they kind of mark out because they'll be like, I was a fan sitting here as a kid. This was my dream, even today. But unfortunately, today, it's just another stop on the WWE gravy train, circus, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, WWE, according to Bruce Pritchard on his podcast, that MSG costs so much money to rent in recent years, the WWE doesn't even go to MSG as much. They go to the Barclays Center because they can't, not that they can't afford it, but they don't want to lose that cut of money to MSG. But let's take a look at SummerSlam 90.
I could be wrong, but the figure I heard was about $600,000 to rent it for the night, pay for the security, the lighting, everything else. $600,000. There's concerts that will only hit the Meadowlands, the Nassau Coliseum, and Barclays, and skip the Garden for that very reason. Yeah, so it's not just wrestling.
It's one thing that's, I guess you could say, on my bucket list, Evan. I've never been to a show at MSG. I've been on the kind of the perimeter of MSG, but I've never, unfortunately for me, been able to see any type of event there, and that's something I'd like to do before I'm dead.
I would suggest if you go to boxing or the Knicks in a winning season or the Rangers. I would not go to WWE for the Madison Square Garden experience. The last time I was there, somebody threw me some comps. It was a SmackDown, and Elias comes out to sing with the Good Brothers, who were tremendous in New Japan, Gallows and Anderson, and they never came out to wrestle. Gallows and Anderson came out to sing and not wrestle. I wanted to put a gun to my head, okay? I basically walked out. I sat there. I was thinking about Bruno and Billy Graham and Patera and Patterson and Morales. And, and I just said, it was like a sea of kiddies with their parents with Pavlovian dog responses to the entrance music and such. And not one match that I would qualify beyond good or very good. There were no great matches. Finally, I just picked myself up and said, it's just not what it was. Boxing feels the same at Madison Square Garden. You get a championship fight at the Garden and a packed house, you're going to feel that sense of history.
I think one of the Lennox Lewis Evander Holyfield fights was at MSG off the top of my head. I could be wrong.
I remember it's 35 years. Yeah.
I think Lennox fought Ray Mercer at MSG, if I'm not mistaken. But let's take a look at SummerSlam 92. Now, Evan, this one is things really get interesting as far as the history of SummerSlam and this character arc. The Ultimate Warrior, believe it or not, up until 1992, for all his comings and goings and holding up Vince and everything, Ultimate Warrior, as of 1992, as far as I can tell, he's been on every single card of SummerSlam. He's either been in the main event, or he's won a title, and or he's defended a title. And here he is again, Ultimate Warrior, challenging for the world title. And Evan, I'll tell you, man, people always shit on the Ultimate Warrior. I met the guy in 2012. He was nice to me. I can't speak for what he did to others or what he said about others, but he was cool to me. That's all I know. And people said that the guy couldn't work. Okay. Check this out. Ultimate Warrior beats Randy Savage by DQ because Ric Flair and he beat him by countout, actually. Ric Flair and Mr. Hennig came out. Kurt Hennig came out, and they caused a disruption, and Warrior ends up winning the match via countout. But him and Randy Savage had a great match. A lot of people forget about this. They had the WrestleMania 7 match a year and a half earlier in 91. But here they are at SummerSlam, Warrior and Savage. They're not in the main event spot because that's for the Bulldog and Bret Hart. Guess what? Guess how many minutes these two guys put in? Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage in 1992. Guess how many minutes these guys put in at Wembley Stadium, Evan?
20.
28.
Wow. Okay.
And I remember that match being shockingly good. And this is when, as a fan, but still kind of conspiracy oriented even back then, we were thinking, is Ultimate Warrior, has he been replaced by Kerry Von Erich? Because basically he was off the juice, right? So he looked about 30 pounds lighter. It was still Jim Hellwig, but he had a more streamlined physique. He was wearing that goofy body outfit with the painted on muscles, which he didn't need. But he just looked like a different type of guy. But it was still Jim. It was still Jim Hellwig, the Warrior. The guy goes 28 minutes. He wrestles Rick Rude at back-to-back SummerSlams, 89 and 90. He wrestles Hulk Hogan at the – everyone loved that match at WrestleMania 6. Everyone loved the WrestleMania 7 match against Savage. So this guy's got at least a half a dozen classics at WrestleManias and SummerSlams. And people are saying that this guy couldn't work? What gives with that?
Hogan and Warrior, when they opened their match, they went hold for hold. I mean, they were wrestling, and Hogan in Japan is a different guy. He would wrestle quality matches in Japan. And I'm sorry, that's Alexa. She comes on at certain times. Like Siri, Alexa.
I thought that was your wife telling you something. I thought she was chiming in with her opinion on Ultimate Warrior.
Yeah. But let me just say this. The obsessive wrestling fans, they have a good list and a bad list, and never the twain shall meet. And they don't really grasp journalism, where you call it down the middle. I mean, Warrior, had his faults and made some homophobic and other comments that, would not endear him to people. But at the same time, you can't just say the guy couldn't wrestle. He had his shtick, he had his gimmick, shaking the ropes, running in like a lunatic. And what brought it on consumer fraud was when the Warrior and Andre the Giant did those like 10-second matches when Andre was basically immobile towards the end of his career. That was a horrible thing to witness. But what you were saying is absolutely true. When he had his working boots on, the guy could and did wrestle, and you have to give him some credit for that. It's, wrestling fans, many times it's very simplistic, the conclusions they draw, but it's not accurate. Ric Flair wrestled the same match every night. No, he didn't. I was in Philly every month for Flair's title matches. Trust me, when he wrestled Ricky Steamboat or Barry Windham, magnificent wrestlers, it was not the same match as him wrestling El Gigante. Trust me. Trust me on that. I was there. I was there for both. Okay. When a Ric Flair wrestled a Brad Armstrong, it was wrestling elevated to art. When he wrestled a big muscle guy, it was a different kind of match. And sure, he had a couple of favorite spots. Every guy does that. I mean, but you can't say it was the same match. And you can't just say Ultimate Warrior sucked. No redeeming value. Because it's not true. He had his moments, and give the guy his due. He's gone now, and if you didn't like him personally, that's a different story.
Yeah, and just to that point, Ultimate Warrior's last match was against an outed bisexual African American gentleman, Orlando Jordan. And after the match, which Warrior won, he took the microphone and he basically put over Orlando Jordan for 5 minutes to the entire venue. And this SummerSlam, going back to that I did want to ask you one side question, but let's not get too far off the path. Did you ever attend live any of those squashes between Warrior and Andre?
No, but I saw televised matches, and it was pitiful. It was a pitiful spectacle. Andre could barely stand. He could barely get in the ring. And sadly, he wrestled for a couple more years. I believe he was wrestling till like 92. Those matches were like 1989. And there's photos of him wrestling in Mexico at the very end. And he has the singlet, and he has a hernia, and he looked horrible, and he could barely stand. Basically, he would use the ropes to hold him, and the guys would kind of bounce off of him, kind of like, what the guys would do with Dusty with the bionic elbow and such. They were just selling for him because he was done. So yeah, that was a really sad, requiem for a heavyweight kind of moment when Andre and Warrior just squashed them every night in seconds, under a minute. Pitiful.
Yeah.
Pitiful.
Yeah. And I just because I get hung up on this trivia, but Andre, I believe his last match was actually a tag team match in Japan, teaming with Baba, and they just defeated a couple of guys, and Baba did most of the work, from my memory. And then, but this SummerSlam is crucial because this was the first ever pay-per-view card for the WWF. I believe that was outside the United States. First of all, it's in London, England. Second of all, it wasn't broadcast in the United States live. It was on tape delay. There was 3 matches that were held for the house show audience that were not broadcast as part of the American presentation on pay-per-view. If you happen to have the Pro Wrestling Illustrated, 1-900 number or whatever it was, you could actually call hours in advance and get the results and kind of gimmick your friends and win a bet. Hey, I want to bet on SummerSlam. And you can call Bill Apter and Craig Peters and get the results, 5 or 6 hours ahead of the United States broadcast of this thing. And furthermore, this is the first WWF pay-per-view since Hulk Hogan has left the company for a while. I believe, actually, now that I think about it, I think it's the first WWF pay-per-view where Hogan doesn't appear at all. So, I mean, everything, Royal Rumbles, SummerSlams, the thing with Savage and Zeus, that no holds barred, the match pay-per-view, every show, unless I'm forgetting something, Hulk Hogan was on pay-per-view like clockwork, basically, for WWF. SummerSlam 92, which is well-respected, well-loved. It's main evented by Davey Boy Smith and Bret Hart, going 25 minutes and 40 seconds. I would say unquestionably Davey Boy Smith's best match ever and one of Bret Hart's top 10 matches. You also have the Undertaker and Kamala. You have the aforementioned Savage and Warrior. You have the Legion of Doom with Hawk not doing so well. But Evan, what I want to get to is this is the non-Hogan show for the very first time on pay-per-view, and we don't need them. We got Ultimate Warrior, we got Savage, we got Brett and Davey Boy, we got the Undertaker in a gimmick match against Kamala. What do you make of the fact that for the first time, the WWF 1992 is not remembered as a great year overall, but SummerSlam blows the roof off of Wembley? What do you think?
Well, first of all, it was a massive crowd and a wildly successful show. And the main event, as I said prior, Bret Hart and British Bulldog was magnificent. It was wrestling elevated to art, as I like to say. And you couldn't, I would honestly say that was the best SummerSlam match ever. And I wouldn't have, a huge problem defending that. And it was a great match by any standard. And a lot of WWE pay-per-views are mixed bags with, just a lot of stuff slapped together. And that match was special and it felt like an event, and the crowd was totally engrossed, and massive throng of people there. And if I think of SummerSlam going back decades, that would be the match and that would be the show that I would tell people to watch, even though the undercard didn't touch that main event. But just for that main event alone, it was tremendous. And tragically, Davey Boy, was gone at age 38, was it? Or
Yeah, something like that.
yeah, I mean, what a sad demise, because he was a tremendous athlete, a great athlete, and the British Bulldogs were great together. And so you would cherish a match like that because they're few and far between, especially in a promotion that emphasizes entrances and theme songs and sing-alongs and catchphrases. That was great wrestling.
I'm just moving aside so we can take a good look at Davey Boy in all of his glory. Diana Hart. And you know what's another great thing about that match, Evan, was Davey Boy married to Diana Hart, one of the Hart sisters. So many kids in that family. The build up and the fact that it was on all gears, a storyline, the brother versus the brother-in-law, with the sister/wife caught in the middle, the family choosing sides, a predecessor feud, so to speak, to the Owen Hart feud a couple of years later with Brett, and all the things that we saw in the Hart Foundation reunion in '97. But this Davey Boy versus Brett thing really was the start of a beautiful long-term storytelling with the Hart family. And the match lived up to the hype. Now, if you listen to Bret Hart interviews these days, and even in his book, he really puts himself over and says that Davey Boy wasn't returning phone calls because Brett was trying to, plan out the match for weeks ahead of it. And Brett had this vision and Davey Boy wouldn't pick up the phone, and Davey Boy was on a binge with the Anvil. And so Brett basically had to walk Davey Boy through the whole match. Brett also said that at the end of the match, he wanted to do a thing where after he lost, Brett would just sit on the canvas almost like in a state of shock, and Davey Boy would be standing over him with a hand extended for a handshake for like a minute, and Brett would just be sitting there not knowing what to do. And according to Brett, Davey Boy kind of pushed that too quickly. Brett's a perfectionist, which I respect. But sometimes people didn't always. He wasn't the director. He kind of thought he was the director and the star of the movie. You know what I mean? But you can't do both sometimes. Let me say this, because I want to retort to what you just said. You said that SummerSlam '92, that this was probably the best match ever. I'm actually going to say that I'm not going to argue with that, but I would say another choice, if I can get him in the picture here, is Shawn Michaels' return match, SummerSlam 2002, jumping ahead about a decade. Shawn Michaels versus Triple H. Shawn has not worked a match in 4 years on a major level. He did have some type of, match at his wrestling school, but he had a bad back, similar to Mr. Perfect. He comes back to wrestle the street fight. He's wearing jeans. He's fighting Triple H. And this as the undercard match to The Rock versus Brock, SummerSlam 2002. Do you have thoughts on this one, Evan?
Yeah, great match. Can't take it away from him. I just personally, I prefer a more technical match like Davey Boy and Brett, but it's apples and oranges. Both great. Both great.
Yeah, and we haven't seen what I like about this one, similar to Brett and Davey Boy, is that in the Shawn Michaels uh, 27 minutes and 20 seconds, non-sanctioned, Shawn Michaels pinning Triple H. This is his first match back. I will say all day and night that Shawn Michaels' second half of his career is far superior than his first half of his career. All the stuff where he's not jobbing a title to Shane Douglas or Dean Douglas, all the stuff where he's being a pain to everybody, he wasn't like that apparently in the second half. He wasn't even really wearing the world title very much, but he's wrestling guys like Triple H, Chris Jericho. He's having really good matches, and it all starts not too far from you, Nassau Coliseum, 14,797 fans. This is one of those SummerSlams, Evan, and we can kind of segue here, getting away from, year by year, but this is a SummerSlam that, in my opinion, that year was superior to WrestleMania, and it's just a year by year thing. But I think SummerSlam 2002, if you compare it to the WrestleMania that year, I think SummerSlam 2002 with the Brock and Rock and Undertaker pinning Test and Chris Jericho versus Ric Flair, Kurt Angle versus Rey Mysterio, and a hell of a minute match to open the show. What did you think of how SummerSlam fits into the WWE calendar in general, Evan?
Well, as an old school fan, SummerSlam was always perceived as the number 2 pay-per-view of the year after WrestleMania. And the big four were also Royal Rumble and Survivor Series. That shifted over the years. Now you'll have 12 to 14 pay-per-views or premium live events, however you want to call them. And one is not necessarily better than the other. I mean, WrestleMania night 1 could be great and night 2 could be mediocre, and the previous pay-per-view could be better than either night. The following pay-per-view could be better, or worse. There's no rhyme or reason to it. They kind of just throw things against the wall, and it doesn't have that feeling like again, going back to Bret Hart and Davey Boy Smith, that felt like a major event. To me, the show tonight, okay, yeah, it could be very good. It could be very disappointing. It could be a total mishmash. You don't know what you're getting. And maybe next month's pay-per-view will be better, and maybe next month's pay-per-view will be worse. So I don't have that sense of awe and wonder. Oh my God, tonight is the number 2 pay-per-view of the year. I'm looking at it as it's just another show. And this is on WWE for, you're kind of taking with both hands. Let's have 14 pay-per-views a year.
Right.
So they become less meaningful.
Well, the business model has changed, though, in due respect. And in the 90s, I think WCW, 94, 95, they started upping the ante with more and more pay-per-views. That was actually an Eric Bischoff initiative, because he figured we lose money on house shows. We actually make some money on pay-per-views. So Bischoff started pushing the idea of having monthly pay-per-views. The WWF at the time was kind of in the same boat. Like, hey, when we go out on tour in 92, 93, 94, in the US at least, we don't do exceptionally well anymore on house shows, but pay-per-views, for whatever reason, do okay. The WWF started adding the in-your-house pay-per-views to the lineup. They were kind of like a discounted, off-brand pay-per-view, or just a, two-hour pay-per-views for a lesser price, and people like those. And so I think both companies, WCW and WWF, both kind of migrated from being a house show oriented business, which kind of wavered in the mid to late 80s. by the mid 90s, it was pay-per-view, 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 where basically everything flipped. The pay-per-views were now the main source of revenue, and the house shows were advertisements for the pay-per-views. And in the early days of pay-per-view, going back to the WWF Classic in October of '85, it was reverse. You know what I mean? So I just think it's, and now in the 2014 era, when the WWF or the WWE's only any type of competition was Impact Wrestling or TNA Wrestling, and they weren't much competition. The WWE started doing streaming. They started having the $10 a month or $9.99, I think was the gimmick, and so you didn't have to pay for every single pay per view, per show. And I think once they figured that out, like, hey, we can get a pretty good. This is the odd psychology of it, Evan. Like, if we have a premium live event and we advertise it and we build it up, we're going to sell out at least that arena for one night. Like 20,000 people will come to see it because it's going to be televised, and the fans want to be there when titles change hands and when big matches happen. Um, so it's kind of odd because those same fans could save their $200 or their $50 or their $1,000 for a front row seat, stay home and watch it for $10 like everybody else. But it's just an odd psychology between the fans, and just things change is my point.
Well, I don't quite understand the religious fervor of it all today, where at WrestleMania 40, they were getting VIP packages starting at $23,000. Starting at $23,000. So, that I just don't get it. And even more scary, I think, is the fact that when you have 50,000 plus people at any given pay-per-view, like you will tonight, they can't all be rich. They can't all be rich. Tonight's $966 ringside. $966
Wow.
ringside. Imagine taking a family of four. So the point being, how many of these guys are maxing out their credit cards? How many of these guys are getting themselves in trouble? It could be an addiction like anything else. And I don't quite get it. I certainly don't see the value of it. I was sitting at Forbidden Door, AEW, a couple of weeks ago, and Swerve Strickland and Will Ospreay had an incredible match. I wouldn't have paid $595 ringside, which is what it cost, no matter how good it is. I just don't get it, to be honest.
Yeah, and I see that, but it's perspective. I mean, when we were younger fans, Evan, the guy down the street may have looked at us like, why are you going to Madison Square Garden on a Monday night for 2.5 hours? Or, for me as a kid, why are you making such a big deal about going to the Capitol Center? And I get it. It is absurd that people would pay that much money to sit ringside when they could watch it at home for $10. But at the same time, if they're going to, a WWE show and paying $1,000, at least they're not putting heroin in their arm. I mean, I guess we can say that. I don't know.
That's a good catchphrase. At least they're not putting heroin in their arm.
Yeah. Are you ready? I want to get to this topic, and this 45 minutes is just flying by. But Evan, what do you think of SummerSlam? I think it's starting in 2025 when they're going to 2 nights. They've already announced that, and to me, that's highly. I saw it coming once they started doing 2 nights for WrestleMania. In fact, before they even pulled the trigger on 2 nights for WrestleMania, I kind of saw that coming too. But now they're adding a 2-night SummerSlam. I believe it's going to be every year moving forward. At least they're going to try it for a year. What do you think of that development?
I think it's a money grab. I think it's an opportunity for them to charge even more and rationalize. Oh, it's not 1 ticket; it's 2 tickets. It's not a 1-day event. It's 2 days of quote unquote wrestling action. And I think sometimes it's almost, like I said prior, it's too much. It's too much. You burn out. You can only sit there so long and absorb so much. And like I said, I was at Forbidden Door. There were 15 matches. And unless the match was great, and very few reach great, you're kind of numb. and 2 days of wrestling is not necessarily better than one, and inevitably one day is going to be better than the other. They're not going to be equivalent. And if the first day is better than the second day, you have a problem, because you're going to have people who are tired and burnt out, and you might not get the Pavlovian dog response that you're hoping for. you know.
On the flip side of that psychology, Evan, I remember a few years ago when they had that 2-night WrestleMania and Steve Austin wrestled, kind of a surprise match against Kevin Owens. Like that was a kind of a bonus main event on the first night, and people were saying that first night of WrestleMania was one of the best nights of any WrestleMania. And the second night, if that was an A, the second night was like a B plus. You still had they even brought back Vince versus Steve Austin in kind of a makeshift skirmish. And people really enjoyed that show. And even though people by and large said that the night one with Owens and Austin was superior, it wasn't by so much that anyone felt disappointed with night two. The other thing, go ahead.
These are also fanatical fans willing to spend thousands of dollars. They're not looking at it as a jaded old school fan like myself who has been attending for 50 years.
Right.
The first match I attended was 1974. Bruno and Strongbow against Nikolai and Blassie at Madison Square Garden. So I'm not going to sit there marking out for anything and everything. I remember night 2 of WrestleMania that you're describing. Austin does a move on Vince, and he so oversold it, it was cartoonish. To me, I sat there and said to myself, "This is ridiculous," and they'll love it, and I'll sit there, just stultifying a lot of it. So, yeah, they're going to have a much higher opinion of what they're watching than I might.
And I understand that. And I mean, I think a lot of it, Evan, is, and here's where I stand, and I'm at the point where, and for several years I've been at this point, I don't necessarily feel inclined to watch every episode of Raw or SmackDown or anything, because with 20 minutes of YouTube a week, I can catch up on all the storylines that I care to catch up on. With NXT, I never watch their weekly show, and I don't watch their premium live events, but I do go to the house shows for NXT because I like seeing the young talent without all the gimmicks. And when I have tuned into NXT on television, it's such a syrupy, processed, imitation cheese version of pro wrestling that I don't like it. But if I go to the house show and you can kind of interact with some of these wrestlers, I just met that Olympic gold medalist lady. Talked to her for a few minutes in Gainesville, Florida at one of these shows. The wrestlers are really nice. They're humble. They're wrestling in front of 400 people. Typically, these venues are small. They're intimate. And it's basically like the WWE with Triple H are creating a facsimile of old school territory wrestling because, and I don't know if they're making money or losing money or breaking even with these NXT house shows, Evan, but the idea is they're trying to teach their current young wrestlers who've been spoon-fed a pretty easy opportunity in comparison to the Mick Foleys and the Ric Flairs and the Lou Theszes of the world. They're trying to show them just a little bit of a taste of what it used to be like to work a territory, to work small house shows. And I'm there for it because I think it's important. And, I know the WWE goes to Saudi Arabia and bends the knee. I know that Vince McMahon shits on women's heads. I know that all these things that the WWE does that I don't approve of morally, but the one thing they do is they're trying to give their young talent a taste of old school wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have these guys work their way up and pay dues and, really sit at the knees of legends like Shawn Michaels and learn. Like Dusty was very influential, and Dusty Rhodes, and he's gone now. So, it's the next generation like Shawn Michaels and Triple H who could teach these guys and women. So, yeah, absolutely. And you can't have such a reduced schedule where they're not getting ring time. We started the interview, the show with, back in the territories days, guys wrestled hundreds and hundreds of matches. So like a Roman Reigns who wrestled 11 matches in an entire year, this would not work for a newcomer who needs the ring time, needs the experience, needs different opponents, needs guidance, from a veteran or veterans. A complaint that I hear, I'm friends with a lot of the legends. They say a lot of the younger kids, they don't want to listen to an old timer. They think they know it all. I'm not making a blanket statement. Some, and a smart young wrestler would really try to pick the brains of, whoever is willing to talk to them and teach them and graciously bestow their wisdom upon them. I see the same thing with young musicians. Sometimes you have to listen and learn. And there's a lot of ageism in the United States. There's a lot of, the word old is hurled like a curse. And sometimes the older guys and women, they've lived it, they've breathed it. There's a lot of knowledge you can get from them. And exactly what you're saying with NXT, let it be a farm system that really teaches them on every level, not just overwrought ring entrances, where every step and every facial expression is rehearsed, and doesn't look legit. Yeah, that's basically, I agree with you.
Yeah, and I think I saw Fit Finley in the parking lot of the last NXT show I went to live, and I think he's one of the trainers. I think Norman Smiley, who never really had a WWE run, but I think Norman Smiley's with NXT. And
universally respected, Norman Smiley. Everybody,
yep.
Yeah. So you pick these guys' brains and sit with them in that parking lot, and learn from them. Absolutely.
And I got to give a shout out to Oni Larkin was his WWE name, but he never really made it to the main roster as a wrestler. But Oni, and he used to be called Biff Busick in New England at Top Rope Promotions, but as a wrestler, he's now a trainer. And so it's interesting that some of the people they bring in to be wrestlers, they decide, hey, you're not right as a wrestler. But in Oni's case, or they basically said, well, we like you so much, you're such a professional and you have something to teach. They didn't make him a wrestler on the main roster, but they repackaged him as a trainer. And I talked to him very briefly at the last time I saw him, and he said, I kind of still want to be in the ring. And I said, hey, but it's less bumps, like you're not, yes, you're not getting the spotlight of being the wrestler. You're the trainer now, but at least you're not, getting a DDT or a suplex every night.
One of the greatest trainers in wrestling history, Johnny Rodz, who may not have had the greatest one-loss record in WWF or WWF, but trained some of the biggest names in the history of the business. So, yeah, absolutely. A wrestler can transition into a great trainer and extend their career, until the day they die. They could keep training. It's, yeah.
Let me just wrap this thing up because we're pulling up on the hour, and I respect your time, and we both have a SummerSlam to watch. But a guy that I'm not a big a fan of, but a guy that's had a big impact at SummerSlam just a couple of years ago, he was driving like a forklift into the ring, which was a pretty good visual image against Roman Reigns. And he's in the background here, Brock Lesnar. Of course, he beats The Rock at SummerSlam 2002. I actually totally forgot about this match, but I have all the results here. 2003, apparently he lost to Kurt Angle via submission, which I don't remember Brock Lesnar ever submitting, but it's here in black and white. So I'm going to have to look that one up. But Brock Lesnar, 2014 SummerSlam, he suplexed John Cena for 15 minutes and got the yeah. So what do you think of Brock Lesnar when it comes to wrestling and SummerSlam?
I think Brock Lesnar is so imposing. He's a beast. I mean, that's one time the WWE hype lives up to. I mean, this is the last guy you'd ever want to get angry, So yeah, I mean, the guy just oozes, machismo or whatever the case may be. This guy could kill you with his bare hands, and totally convincing, totally over. I think in recent years, I got the sense his heart wasn't quite as much in it. It was like quickie matches, like he had to train to catch. But back then, the matches you're referring to, the guy was really, really impressive.
Yeah, and he's pulling up on 50 years old now. So I mean, he's had a UFC fighter, mixed martial artist. He went out for the NFL, didn't do too well.
He's the real deal. That guy could kill you with his bare hands.
Yeah, the word I would use for Brock, and I'm not a fan of Brock, I really am not, but I mean legitimate. He's a legitimate badass. Any generation, whether it's 50 years from now or 1,000 years ago, he would be fighting Spartacus or whoever.
He's fighting a lion.
Yeah. So I mean, you got to give it up to him. And then the Undertaker, we didn't even get into him, but he's had some great SummerSlam moments against Bret Hart in '97. You know what I mean? Shawn Michaels to Triple H, The Rock. I mean, I believe it was a SummerSlam where The Rock, Ken Shamrock, and Mick Foley had a cage match as kind of a bonus match, if I'm remembering that correctly. I think that's SummerSlam '98 or '99. But there's so many heroes come and gone from SummerSlam. And any final thoughts as we wrap this thing up, Evan?
Well, I appreciate you having me back on. And if your viewers enjoy conversations like this, I have a page called Evan Ginsburg's Old School Wrestling Memories. We do 15, 20 posts a day. And one of my readers submitted a Farmer Burns clip from 1897. That's how far back we go. So
love it.
So if you want to check out some real old school, and check out a documentary that I did about 20 years ago. It's called Wrestling Then and Now. And Killer Kowalski, Don Arnold, Nikolai Volkov, Homicide. That's, some interesting people in there. And 350 Days. Yours truly, the senior editor over at ProWrestlingStories.com. We have over 900 articles on there. Wrestling's rich history. And much respect to Mike Messier for his being one of the most outspoken, wrestling journalists. Journalists say both sides of the story, not just, I love WWE, I hate AEW, or I love AEW, I hate WWE. Mike Messier calls it down the middle. And yeah, man, much respect. And Mike's a filmmaker and a writer and everything else. A true Renaissance man. I mean that sincerely.
I appreciate it.
We go back a long time now.
Yeah, and I get to met Evan in person in New York, which was awesome. And I'll be taking a little New England tour later this year. And so hopefully, if it works out, we'll see each other. If not, that's okay. But I hope to see you. And some of our mutual friends, Benny Scala is a contributor, I believe, to your website. And our mutual friend, Nikita Breznikov, I'm deep into his book. I've been reading it throughout Whataburgers in the state of Florida, and I'm in the year 1978 in the Nikita Breznikov's When It Was Real book. But Evan, such a pleasure to be here. One Pro Wrestling and Sports Fan YouTube channel. I will be rebroadcasting this on Twitter. If anyone has any comments for me, please do. Subscribe to this channel, subscribe to Evan's channels, and most of all, folks, enjoy SummerSlam tonight and moving forward. Thank you, and good night.
My pleasure. Okay. Thanks, Mike.